Hey guys, it's me, Holly Madison. Welcome back to my channel. Today I decided to do a video answering your questions about my first book, Down the Rabbit Hole. I asked you to ask me questions about it and about reactions to it, and some of it's like personal topics, so if I get a little like low energy, it's because I tend to shut down a little bit. Like verbally, I'm gonna be real, but I tend to like shut down a little bit emotionally when I talk about those things. So I might be a little like weird and vulnerable today, but that's okay because we're switching it up. So if you'd hit the like and subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. And let's talk about it. Okay, first question. Lily in the River Valley asks, how long did it take to write? I would say from very start to finish, 2 years. And part of that was the editing process. Once you get it to the publisher, you work with an editor who will go back and forth with you about it. But from when I decided I was going to for sure write it to publication date, 2 years. And it wasn't the only project I was working on at the time. And I had like just had my first baby during that time. So I was busy with a lot of other things, but 2 years, I'm glad I had that amount of time to do my first book because I think I needed it. I did my second book within like 6 months. There was like a year between me having the idea to do it and it getting published, and 6 months of that was the editing process. So I basically had to write the whole thing in 6 months, and I wish I would have had more time with it. So I think ideally it would be nice to have like a year with a manuscript and then go into editing, which is more or less what happened with my first book. Because Ingrid Said So asked, is there anything you regret writing in it? There's nothing I regret as far as a subject, but there is something I would say differently. And one of the things I talked about in the book a lot was plastic surgery. And the reason I did that was I wanted to give the reader a full picture of the dysmorphia that went on in that environment. And it wasn't a judgment on any one person, or especially any one woman who'd had plastic surgery. I've had plastic surgery myself, and I was definitely in that group of people who were dysmorphic and felt like I was never going to be pretty enough. But I wanted to portray that because it showed how it was kind of an unhealthy side effect of that environment. But I would have said it differently because I think, and I didn't realize this until after the book was published, I think it kind of came off a little bit like I was bagging on someone's appearance. And this would be a person who was not named by name. It would be somebody who I created like a fake name and identifying characteristics for. So it wasn't like I was even coming at one person. But I think it kind of read that way, that I was like bagging on her appearance, when really that wasn't the intention. The intention was more to show like, okay, you have this woman in her late 20s, but she ended up making herself look way older because she'd already had so much Botox and so much filler. And it was more a commentary on just how morphed so many of us were and how unhealthy that whole thing was. And my book was published in 2015. This whole experience I had that I wrote about in the book happened from like 2001 to 2008, 9. And definitely people have more plastic surgery now than they used to. I think Instagram has made everybody really dysmorphic and competitive with their appearances. But back then, there was a huge difference between like how the real world approached plastic surgery and how a lot of the women inside the mansion approached plastic surgery. And I think I just would have said it differently if I could redo that part. I'm not going to read the names of everybody who asked questions because sometimes it's obvious what somebody's name is in the tag, but sometimes the handle just kind of looks like a bunch of letters and I can't figure out what it's supposed to be short for or what the word is. So I'm just going to say, somebody asked, what made you want to write the book? The reason I wanted to write the book is because at that point in time, I decided to write it around like early 2013. And around that point in time, it got to be a thing where like every day out in public, people would ask me, oh, how's Hef? And I would always like say nice things because I just thought it was the right thing to do and that it was the nice and normal thing to do. And I didn't want to get into these big, deep conversations with people I was just meeting on the street, and I'd just be like, oh yeah, he's good. But then I started to feel weird about it because sometimes people would press for more information or ask more questions, and I would always try to keep it positive. But in my heart, like I wasn't feeling any positivity about the subject or the situation. And I just started to feel like I was living a lie. And also I felt like it was weird that he would kind of say snarky things about me in the media, but at the same time I kind of felt like everybody expected me to just be like a cheerleader for a brand that I no longer had anything to do with. And I just felt like this is weird, and I just wanted to get my truth out there and tell my story. Callie Treasure asks, how did it feel getting the book out? It felt really good. It was like a stressful week promoting it because you do interviews about it and then everything's kind of blown up into like these big clickbaity headlines that are kind of crazy, and like people will just read the headline and not the book, and they'll react really crazy and attack you. So that was kind of stressful, but it felt really good to finally get my story out. It definitely, I felt freer and I felt more like I could be myself. Sasha J asked, was it weird having that routine every day being so young? And in case you don't know, what she's asking about is when you lived at the mansion, there were a lot of rules you were expected to follow, and you were kind of always expected to be places on certain days. And at the time, I didn't feel like it was weird having that kind of a routine. I'm a Capricorn, and they always say Capricorns are like old when they're young and young when they're old. So I always had this very like old soul vibe about me. And when I was in my early 20s, it kind of fit my personality to have that much structure. But of course, it was also really extreme. And over time, I think that caused some damage because I wasn't, you know, pursuing a career in a normal way or dating in a normal way throughout my entire 20s. And I've had therapists tell me since then that I have arrested development because of that, because I spent my 20s kind of in this incubator that even though I'm 40 now, it's like mentally I'm kind of more like a 30-year-old. I'm kind of like that typical 30-year-old millennial who like can't adult. Like that's more what I relate to, more so than people my own age, which is fine. You know, I never wanted an ordinary life, so I'm not going to complain about that, but it was definitely interesting, that's for sure. Pixie Joe asks, this title reminds me of old-timey book titles. Is that why it's so long? I assume you're asking because it has a long subtitle. It's called Down the Rabbit Hole, Curious Adventures and Cautionary Tales of a Former Playboy Bunny. And the reason it has such a long subtitle is my publisher was telling me at the time, because this was 2015, so most of the bookstores had closed and everybody was searching for books online, that it was really helpful as far as book sales went to have a subtitle that's as descriptive as possible. So originally I just wanted it to be like The Curious Adventures of Holly Madison, because that just says it's my story and it goes with Down the Rabbit Hole, the title. But they really wanted something about Playboy in the subtitle, and I definitely didn't want to use his name because the book was never meant to be like a biography of him, and I just wanted it to be about my story. So I compromised and I'm like, okay, you can put Playboy Bunny in there because people might search for that. Bus Blog asks, did anyone give you a hard time about your adorable British accent in the audiobook? Nobody's given me a hard time about it. What she was referring to is at the start of each chapter, there's a quote from Lewis Carroll from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And for each chapter, I picked a quote that kind of related to a theme that went on in the chapter. And when I was reading aloud for my audiobook, because those quotes were someone else's words and not mine, I didn't feel right saying it in my voice. So it kind of came out this like British accent. Probably sounded really corny. It wasn't something I prepared for or practiced for, but I just wanted it to sound different than my own voice because they weren't my words. Also, just something I tend to do in general when I'm like relating a story to someone. If I'm saying someone else's words, I tend to like automatically go into an impression of them, maybe about 50% of the time. So I don't know what Lewis Carroll sounded like, but that's kind of along those same lines. Gabrielle asks, was there anything good about your time with Hef? I'm sure there must have been because I liked him at the time, but for some reason it's just harder for me to remember that stuff. Like when I left, I just wasn't really thinking about the past at all. I was just in survival mode. Like you have to start a brand new life. Like you got to hit the ground running and get going. And then after a couple of years of that, when I kind of started looking back on that and like, you know, unpacking things literally and figuratively, whether it was like my scrapbooks or old Girls Next Door souvenirs or something, like memories would start to come back. I had someone else pass away recently, and it was somebody who I'd had a lot of conflict with and hadn't spoken to in like 8 years. And when they passed away, all that conflict kind of like fell away, and all I remembered were the good times. But I still, when I think back on my years at the mansion, most of what I remember that was good either came through like opportunities we got from outside sources, or friendships I had with some of the other women, or friendships I had with people in that whole circle. Somebody else asked, how did you prepare for doing the voices of the characters? And that goes back to the other question about the British accent. Sometimes when I tell stories, like if I was saying something that Hef said or somebody else said, I would kind of go into like my impression of them, just because it's automatic for me. I didn't like prepare. I'm not saying the impressions were good. I don't know. It's just like how it comes out when I read it. And I think it makes the listening experience a little better because everybody doesn't have the same exact voice, but it was just something that happened automatically. I didn't prepare for it. Vanessa asks, did you think you'd be helping so many people change their lives for the better? I had hoped so. I had hoped by getting my story out that it would help other people who were in similar types of relationships maybe realize what they were dealing with or what they had been dealing with. And I get feedback all the time, even now, from people who are so happy to have read the book because they started to see parallels in their own life. And they're like, if I hadn't read that, I wouldn't have realized how I'd been treated this whole time and finally found the strength to walk away. So when I hear that, it just makes me so happy. And, you know, the whole reason I wanted to tell my story was I just had this really strong emotional urge to tell my truth because I felt like I was living a lie. And I feel like when that's the motivation and you're sharing a genuine story, it does resonate with the people it's supposed to resonate with. Like I got some other questions where people were like, was it your decision to write the book, or was it like your PR or your manager? No, nobody else. No, it was all my idea. It wasn't any kind of like career thing. I wasn't even trying to do career stuff. I had just got married and had a baby, and I had done all this stuff that I'd wanted to do. I wasn't looking to like boost my career or do anything by releasing the book. I just finally wanted to tell my story. Crystal asks, are you mad people still love Girls Next Door even though your book painted it as a bad time? No, not at all. Like the show kind of saved my life. Like the show was what gave me confidence to be able to move on, and the fans of the show are what gave me confidence to move on. There were things here and there that weren't great about it, like they didn't want to pay us for it in the beginning, and they didn't pay us for the first half of the first season. And of course there's times I think maybe all of us felt a little frustrated because our characters were supposed to be so one-dimensional, but I think that's common with most projects. I think most, even TV actors get frustrated because they think that everyone thinks they're that character from TV, and they're not necessarily. But overall, the show was a really positive experience. It gave me so much confidence, and it helped make that whole situation into something good in the very end, and it gave me the confidence to leave. So no, I'm not mad that people love the show. You know what I think is weird though, is when I see like 15-year-olds on TikTok wearing Playboy merchandise. Blood Bunny asks, did paparazzi really hang around, or were they called to take pics of celebs there? Meaning the mansion, I guess. There were never any random paparazzi allowed up at the mansion, and there never would have been anybody waiting outside the gate because it was so secure. They would have known they were never going to get in. But there were photographers at the parties and at the events that were invited, and people that worked for Playboy taking pictures. And also, you know, Hef had personal photographers that would sometimes come out with us at night, and you know, we would see other paparazzi kind of stationed outside clubs and stuff, because that's what happens in LA. You'll run into a lot of photographers, not necessarily because they're following you, but because they will hang out in front of certain restaurants that they know a lot of recognizable people go to, or outside a gym or something like that, and they'll just wait for anybody they recognize to come out and start taking pictures of. It's kind of unavoidable. And it's a little annoying, especially if you're like me and you're not like trying to promote anything and you're not trying to like be out there, but still there's like a random photographer outside your house or like in front of the Starbucks. And then some people, like jerks, will write me on social media and be like, oh, you're staged paparazzi pictures. I'm like, honey, I would have been wearing a much cuter outfit and like put on some makeup if I had staged that photo. So give me a break. Somebody asked, did you go to Mary's funeral, meaning Mary O'Connor, who was Hef's secretary and one of my closest friends? I did not, but that was only because the funeral was right when I was giving birth to my daughter. So it was in LA and I was in Las Vegas at the time. So I would have loved to have gone because I loved Mary, but it was not the right time. Somebody asked, what's it like to have to face haters hating on your trauma? Does it feel like fresh trauma? Yes, and I call that trauma part 2, not just for me, but when I'm talking about situations with other people. For example, when the Me Too movement really hit mainstream and all these people were coming out with their stories, sometimes, you know, you'd be discussing this stuff with friends and people would go, well, why are they just coming out now? This happened years ago. Why are they just coming up now? I can tell you why it took years is because when something like that happens to you, you know you're going to be dragged through the mud, and it's not necessarily the easiest thing to prove. So coming out is going to be trauma part 2. Sometimes when something like that happens, and when I say something like that, it could mean anything along a spectrum. You know, there's all kinds of shades of gray. I'm not trying to equate my situation necessarily with some situations that are more serious or even some that are less than. I'm just saying when somebody's in that kind of a situation, sometimes they're just ashamed even though they did nothing wrong, but they still have that feeling based on everything society heaps upon women, and they don't want to come forward because they know they're just going to be dragged and it's nothing they can really physically prove. So I call that trauma part 2. Like, you're already going through trauma part 1. You don't necessarily want to go through trauma part 2. So that's why I think it takes so many people sometimes so long to step forward, is sometimes they don't want to do it unless they know somebody else has been in that exact situation. Sometimes they don't have the courage or even want to just deal with the BS in their own life. Like, why should they punish themselves more? So yeah, it's definitely weird to have people, you know, hate on my truth and my experience that I went through. But I know that usually it says more about them than it does about me. But at the time in my life, I just felt like there wasn't any other option. I just felt like I was going to absolutely burst if I didn't tell my truth. I don't know why that is. I mean, I can think of a couple reasons, but I don't know why the feeling was so strong. I think there's just sometimes things that you're meant to do in this life, and that was one of them. Somebody asks, what was your favorite meal at the mansion? This is gonna sound weird. It was a healthy one, but I used to always get this salmon sandwich that was like a grilled salmon fillet on a baguette, and it had this really delicious like aioli sauce or something, and lettuce and tomato, and it was just so delicious. Like, I know it doesn't sound that great the way I'm talking about it. It sounds kind of random, but it was so good. That was a favorite. And also they would make an Olive Garden salad dupe that everyone loved to order. And then there was also this salad that Sarah Underwood, a playmate, would order, and we called it the Sarah salad, and it was like romaine lettuce, cheese, ranch, egg. It was so good. Tomatoes. I feel like the dishes don't sound as good when I'm breaking down the ingredients, but they were really good. Also, everyone loved the chocolate cake that the chefs made there. That was a favorite. And they used to have in the kitchen these giant drawers, like drawers built into the wall, huge drawers full of cookies. Like, every day they would make just batches and batches of cookies. And it was just kind of surreal. It was very Willy Wonka, those cookie drawers. Jamie Michelle asks, now that Hef has passed away, would you tell more stories? No, because the reason I chose to tell the stories that I did was because I chose the stories that affected my mental and emotional health and decisions I made and the atmosphere around me while I was there. People have all kinds of like weird, crazy questions that I just didn't feel like were relevant to my journey, so I didn't put them in there because of that. It really wasn't a concern whether somebody was alive or not. I mean, like, I just knew that he wasn't gonna like the book anyway, so. Jamie629 asks, did you expect the backlash it received from some people? Yeah, definitely. I definitely knew there were certain people who were not going to like it. I think what surprised me were like some rando McRandersons like came out of the woodwork. It's just like people that I didn't even know or didn't know me, but they had their own motives to try and like come out and accuse me of things, and it was weird and kind of funny in hindsight. Sandy asks, why did you use false names and then some real names for certain people? That's an excellent question, and that is actually all decided by the legal department. Because when you write a book about real people, you have to go through it with a lawyer. You have to make sure your claims are backed up. You know, do you have journals? Do you have scrapbooks? Did you have people you told about this at the time? Are there other people who can back up your story? Are there other people who have told the same aspect of this story before publicly? So you have to go through all of that. And the reason I changed some people's names and not others is because if I could have changed almost everyone's name, I would have, just because I didn't have an axe to grind with these people, even if it was somebody who was like really mean to me back in the day. Like, I kind of get it, just because we were in a toxic situation. So I would have changed everybody's name. I could have, if I could have gotten away with it. But if somebody is an identifiable public figure, you're not supposed to change their name. If you can very easily Google who they are, you are not supposed to change their name. So that decision was a little bit out of my hands. For example, there was one character in the book who came along after my mansion days, and it was important to me to tell that story because this was about me getting out of a really bad relationship and almost rebounding into another very similar one very quickly, recognizing that was not for me and moving on to finally being independent. So it was important for me to tell that story, and I had no interest in using the person's real name. Like in the original draft, like the name was changed, where that person worked was changed, where that person lived was changed, what that person did for a living was changed, because it wasn't about that person. Like I wasn't writing it to like, stab a knife in the back of that person. I could care less. That person wasn't in my life. I just thought it was an important aspect of my story to tell. But at 0 hour, when I was going over the manuscript with the lawyer, they're like, no, you have to change this for legal reasons because that person is way too easily Googleable. No matter all these changes you've made, you can still find out who that person is, and they're a public figure. So it's just the way the legal world works, and that's why some people I use their real names and some people I don't. And of course, there were plenty of people whose real names I used because I had only positive things to say about them. I think that gets brushed under the rug a lot because the main shock value of my book when it was being promoted was because I'm saying these surprising things about people that nobody knew before or would have guessed. And there were a lot of people I spoke really positively about as well, but that gets brushed under the rug. Like I remember at the time, I try to stay away from like reading reviews and stuff, but I would see people write reviews online and they'll be like, she doesn't have anything positive to say about anybody. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I think the difference is, and why people register the negative stuff more, is when you're saying something negative about someone because it affected you and your story in a certain way, you kind of have to back it up. Like you can't just say, oh, so-and-so sucks and not give a reason. But you can say someone is an amazing friend and really supportive, and people will accept that at face value. So it doesn't, the pay on doesn't have to be as wordy as the denunciation to make people understand. But then I think sometimes people walk away with, oh my God, it was so negative, because you have to explain the negative stuff a little bit more than just the positive stuff. So when you say somebody was a really supportive, amazing friend and they were there for me, people get that right away. But when you're saying, oh, somebody manipulated people this way, you kind of have to explain it a little bit more. But there were a lot of people who had a really positive impact on my life, and I didn't change their names. So there you go. And Rebecca asks, whose reaction surprised you? And I wouldn't say it was just one person. It was, like I said before, those randoms that kind of came out of the woodwork. And then the weirdest reaction. Hey guys, I'm back on a different day finishing this video. Several of you asked what was the weirdest reaction to my book, and there's a couple. I would say when my book came out, it was 2015, so it was before the Me Too movement really went mainstream. And I think if the book had come out later, after that, people would have seen it for what it was. I was talking about a casting couch situation, something that's kind of an abuse of power. And at the time in 2015, a lot of people got it, don't get me wrong, but there were still some people who didn't really get it or didn't understand what I was trying to say. The other weirdest reaction, it's one of those things that's just, I cringe over it. Not because I'm embarrassed, but it's cringe to me. And it was somebody who I think was trying to gain favor from Hef by like coming out in his defense, kind of, at least that's what I think her motivation was. And she was upset because she didn't get chosen as Playmate when she tried out, I would say like in 2006 maybe, because it was right when I started interning at the studio. And for those of you who don't know, when I was at the mansion, I worked as the editor of the Playmate pictorials for the last 2 years or so that I was there. And in 2006, they covered it for an episode of Girls Next Door. I went to the studio and I interned under Marilyn Grabowski and the photographers that worked there. And when this woman came in to test, I was still an intern. And the day she tested, I had nothing to do with her photo shoot. I wasn't on set for it. I remember her being there because some people were talking about her, but I was in my office that day doing something else. I wasn't on her shoot. And also, even when I had the job as Playmate editor, I was never in charge of who was chosen. That was Hef's job. It was one of his favorite things about work. And if a candidate came in that I thought had a really amazing personality or had something really interesting about her background, I would certainly say that to him because that was something he wouldn't always see. Like I would see it because I would drive them to the studio every morning and I would be there for their test shoot and talk to them and whatnot. He could see what they looked like. I didn't need to tell him, But either way, even when I was the editor, I would direct the shoots and edit the photos and send the final photos off to the Chicago offices. I was not in charge of picking the girls whatsoever. So this woman who had come out to test for Playmate, after my book came out, she went to a gossip column and said that she knew I was lying about everything, which is pretty egregious considering the fact that not only does she have no idea what my relationship was like, but she wasn't even someone who, maybe she came to one of the bigger parties, I don't know, but she definitely wasn't in the inner circle in any way, shape, or form. The only time I saw her in person was that day at the studio, but she was in no way in the inner circle. Like, she didn't know Hef, she didn't know any of the people. But she said I was lying about everything, and the reason that she didn't get picked as Playmate was because I was so jealous of her. Okay, I mean, you can take a look at all the women who were published in the magazine during the time I worked there and wonder why I wasn't jealous of them. I don't know. But I had nothing to do with her test or her selection process or anything like that. And I just think it's kind of sad that when you don't get picked for something, and it was a very easy thing to not get picked for. It's not even about who's more beautiful or who's not. It's just like, at the time, the look was very cookie cutter, but not cookie cutter enough so that they were kind of looking for variety. So it's just, and it was competitive. There were only 12 Playmates in a year. So if you didn't get it, you know, nothing wrong with you. It's just, there can only be so many. But instead of accepting that, she decides that it had to be because some woman was jealous of her. Like, can we move on? So that was what stands out as the weirdest reaction. But anyway, I want to thank you guys for all the questions. It's always fun talking to you guys. I was going to say it's super fun answering them, but this topic is just one that, like I said in the beginning of this video, it tends to like drain me a little bit. So sorry if I was low energy. I've also been low energy because I've been super busy for the last month and a half, which I love. I'm super grateful for. But yeah, I'll be excited to get my energy back up again. But thank you so much for submitting the questions, and let me know in the comment section what kind of video you'd like to see next. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.